Hello and welcome to another episode of Hollywood Wargaming Unit Reviews for Star Wars Legion. And today we are going to be looking at Darth Maul, and this one is a little bit late along with the Anakin Skywalker video, but we're getting to it. It's going to be very in-depth, and hopefully not as long as the Anakin Skywalker video, so I will cut some of the banter and dive right into this. Much like Anakin, Maul is a character that we all anticipated to show up in this game, especially considering that there aren't a whole lot of Dark Jedi or Sith that show up in the Clone Wars outside of the films. And with Anakin and Maul now dropped, we have two of the major players now under our belt and into our lists. And while Maul was alive during the second and third films when the Clone Wars was taking place, this is very much Episode 1 Maul, which is personally my preferred version of Maul, but it does beg the question if someone like Qui-Gon Jinn might be showing up in the future. But what makes this drop alongside Anakin Skywalker pretty interesting is the fact that Anakin Skywalker is a commander, and Darth Maul himself is an operative and also comes with a Special Forces probe droid upgrade. Now, these are going to be the DRK-1 probe droids that are operating as their own unit, but do have the Detachment Maul keyword, meaning that they cannot be fielded unless you bring Maul alongside with them. And these droids are going to have their own separate video alongside Maul, just to spare you the time. But being that this review is intended to be all-encompassing, I will mention that these droids are a good upgrade to take and worthwhile taking alongside Maul, as they are a very cheap unit and will synergize in a CIS list very effectively, especially when you have multiple heroes, which you will be having considering that Maul is an operative. And I think that is the big takeaway from this release, is the fact that FFG, or, well, soon to be Atomic Mass Studios, is willing to branch away from that mirror release strategy that they've had, where it's always been kind of two operatives released for one side and another, two special forces, and so on and so on. Here we have the Anakin Skywalker Commander release right alongside the operative Darth Maul, who also has a special forces upgrade with him. It's two very diverse upgrades, even though their unit cards do somewhat mirror each other. So let's go ahead and dive right in and take a look at Maul's unit card for Star Wars Legion. And much like Anakin, we are going to have a 160 point unit that is going to have 2 force upgrades and 2 training upgrades. And I suppose that is very befitting of Maul, even though we don't really see him use a whole lot of force powers. But I suppose the dual training definitely does fit him. But moving over to his stats on the right side, we're going to see that he is obviously a single model in an operative unit, and he is going to have the relatively generic 6 health, 3 courage with a red defense die. And below that, we are going to see that Maul has no surges, be it offensive or defensive, and then a 2 movement speed. Now, we kind of did expect some surges with Maul. He does kind of seem like the kind of person who would have a surge to crit or something of the sort. But much like Anakin, this is going to be one of those units that really gets creative when you look at his command cards and how other things interact with his overall playstyle. So, to put it bluntly, no surges here, you are going to have to earn them. And moving on to his weapon stats, we're going to see a whopping 4 red dice, accompanied by 4 white dice with Impact 2 and Pierce 2. Now, Maul obviously has a double-bladed saber, and there's a lot of ways they could have represented that in this game. Personally, I thought they were going to do an Arsenal style, kind of like General Grievous. But having that somewhat bipolar dice pool of half red, half white does kind of reflect the idea of fighting with one of your blades offhand. And seeing how they incorporated Maul and his double-bladed lightsaber in this game was something that I was very interested in seeing. And while I don't find this route super interesting, I definitely am not as underwhelmed by Maul's overall character as I am with Anakin Skywalker's. But that is mainly due to the command cards. But of course, the unit is not complete until we look at their keywords, and here Maul is going to start off with Jump 1, a pretty standard for the Jedi, and that is going to be followed up by the Deflect keyword. Again, another standard keyword for most Jedi. He's not Anakin or Obi-Wan where they get special deflect mechanisms, but a bog standard deflect is very much welcome here, and that is going to be followed up by a third very common Jedi keyword, which is Immune Pierce. So yeah, 3 of Maul's 4 keywords are very, very basic, generic Jedi keywords. However, they are all very efficient keywords for a lightsaber-wielding unit, so I wouldn't call them a waste of space on this unit card. But last up, we are going to have Maul's one unique keyword, and that is going to be the Joyo Mastery. And this is going to allow you, if you are wounded, meaning if you have at least 1 wound token on you, that you are going to be able to make 1 extra action every turn, with the one caveat that you can only make 2 movement actions of those 3 actions. But that is very, very big, because being able to take an extra action each turn is going to give you a lot of leeway and creativity in how you play this character every time you activate him. Now, you can still only attack once with him, and you can still only move twice, but I can guarantee you there's going to be a lot of really creative plays that you can make with Maul, where that extra action is going to go a long way in how effective he performs on the battlefield. Now, the most obvious of this is that he does not have Charge or Relentless, which, much like Anakin Skywalker, is a very big drawback. However, you're not going to need to play a command card to kind of get the benefits that you would get from Charge or Relentless. Instead, just having one wound on you is going to allow you to move, and attack, which is kind of a pseudo-charge in a lot of ways, but with more flexibility if you really want to look at it. And I could probably go on an hour-long rant in many scenarios where that extra action is going to come in handy. But off the top of my head, the most obvious here is going to be once you've already closed that charge and once you're in melee, you're still going to get 2 extra actions alongside your attack, meaning you can take an aim, a dodge, and then attack your opponent, rather than just having to choose between one of those tokens like you would with a normal Jedi who has Charge or Relentless. Now, the prerequisite of being wounded is a slight drawback here, and while your heroes are almost guaranteed to get wounded in a match, it's not a guarantee that they will when you need it the most. But fortunately, Maul does have a failsafe command card built in that is going to potentially give him a wound that we will look at later. So, with Maul's entire unit card summed up with the keywords, what do I think? Well, I think this is a very powerful base unit card, and I honestly don't think there's going to be a whole lot of need for upgrades, aside from one very obvious one, which of course is going to be Saber Throw. Maul is going to be able to throw 4 red dice with Pierce 2 at range 2 with Saber Throw for just 5 points. That's obviously going to be a must-take on him. But at 165 points, with that one upgrade, I think you have a very powerful unit here, especially when we're going to look at his command cards later, and especially when you consider the fact that he has that Joyo Mastery that's going to give him a lot of flexibility on the battlefield. And having no innate or gainable Master of the Force is going to kind of nullify the benefit of having 2 Force upgrade slots. However, both training upgrades are very welcome, and I think if you have points to spare in your list, you are going to be able to make some nice tweaks to Maul that are going to buff him up in some pretty impressive ways if you play him right. And sure, I do find the lack of surges a little bit disappointing here, but I think Maul makes up for it with the sheer volume of dice he has, accompanied by the ability to perform an extra action each turn. But let's go ahead and look at some of Darth Maul's potential upgrade options here, as it's not a sealed deal overall, and there are some fun perks you can add on here and there. And first up, we are going to have those 2 Force upgrade slots, and much like most other units with 2 upgrade slots, there's usually a no-brainer must-take upgrade. And like I said earlier, with Darth Maul, it is going to be Saber Throw. Not too different from Anakin Skywalker. Half of your dice pool here is going to be 4 red dice, which is a very impressive attack pool. And while Anakin's Saber Throw might be more of a laser beam with the 3 red dice Pierce 3, having 4 red dice with Pierce 2 is nothing to scoff at. And when you consider the fact that Joyo Mastery gives you the ability to move twice and then make a ranged attack, much like Steady, Darth Maul's operational range with Saber Throw becomes a lot more impressive. So yeah, Saber Throw is definitely a must-take, but let's go ahead and look at the second upgrade slot and see if there's any other options here that are viable. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Darth Maul does not have Master of the Force, and he cannot get Master of the Force through a command card, unlike Anakin Skywalker, which makes exhaustible cards somewhat undesirable with him. However, it is worth considering that with Joyo Mastery, you could potentially use one of those actions to make a recovery, and untap those exhausted cards, without infringing on your gameplay otherwise. But with that in mind, let's look at the cards. First up, we have Battle Meditation here. And this is pretty undesirable on an army where all of your non-hero units are pretty much chaff. You're not really going to be wanting to push your command or operative cards onto B1 battle droids. And while you could technically use that to daisy chain a coordinate between your droid army, Maul himself is a very much Alpha Strike character, as we will see when we look at his command cards later. And paying 5 points to potentially not have him with a face-up order token just isn't worth it in my opinion. Now, if you're really big on using your B1 battle droids and having them active, maybe there's something you can work out where you daisy chain your whole army and the 1 token left over is Maul's operative token. But even then, you're looking at a kind of 50-50 shot between pulling his token or the commander's, and that just isn't worth it in my opinion, giving this card a hard skip from me. I think one of these days there will be a time and place for battle meditation, but just not with any of these units so far. So next up we are going to have Force Choke, which of course is exhaustible, but it is going to allow you to remove 1 miniature or add 1 wound to a model if they're a non-commander or operative units. And while this is a great card to have against a faction like the Republic or the Imperials with their expensive infantry models, I just don't know if Darth Maul is going to find the time to continuously exhaust and refresh these cards. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that Joyo Mastery could be used with one of those 3 actions to do that, but I think you'd be better off just playing Maul offensively. However, I think there is a solid argument to be made for equipping this card, as you could potentially get locked in melee and then continuously unexhaust this and just pop off clone troopers nearby you and waste your enemy's expensive infantry. It is a card that can easily pay for itself, but I think it will require some playtesting before I give it the thumbs up. So I will put a maybe for Force Choke, but I'm definitely not going to go into my first game with Maul using it. And next up we are going to have Force Push. You guys know how I feel about Force Push. It's a 10-point exhaustible that allows you to move 1 enemy unit at range 1 with a speed 1 move. And while that is very effective in getting enemies into your combat range and getting them out of cover so your friendly units can blast them, I personally would just much rather prefer to tie them up with melee. And again, on a unit like Maul with no Master of the Force, this 10-point card loses even more of its luster. However, I could see a relatively potent Maul build where you run him into combat and then you have him force choking and force pushing nearby enemies out of cover, allowing your droid army to move up and vaporize what's left pretty efficiently. Now, would that be worth the 15 points and not taking Saber Throw? That's definitely a conversation to be had after we do some playtesting. But much like every other review, it's going to land a big maybe on Force Push. I know a lot of people cannot feel Jedi without it, and I do understand where you're coming from with that sentiment, but personally I don't get a whole lot of utility out of Force Push, so I do think it is up to your list building and playstyle. But next up we are going to have Force Reflexes, which is very much a card that I love. It's a 10-point exhaustible card that basically gives you a dodge token every time you tap it. It's very useful for Jedi to activate that deflect, and when playing against a faction with fire support such as the Republic, it could potentially save your life even if you only tap it once to block 1 giant volley from your opponents. And if you have a Force user with at least Master of the Force 1, I do consider this to be somewhat of a must-take card. However, as we know, Maul does not have Master of the Force, so you are only going to be tapping this once. However, Maul does have the Joyo Mastery, which is going to give you an extra action, meaning you can basically nullify this card, not spend the points on it, and use that extra action to take a dodge every turn instead. Now, there is definitely an argument to be made about having 1 extra dodge up your sleeve. It could very much save your life, especially with a deflect unit, as it gives you defensive surge. But I don't think it's something that I'm going to pay points to run on Maul. So for what I think is the very first time, I am going to not recommend taking Force Reflexes on this Force user. Instead, I'm going to say rely on that Joyo Mastery to get the dodge tokens when you need them the most, and that is going to require a certain amount of finesse and strategy as a commander. But if you pull it off, you will save points to use elsewhere in your force. And after that, we are going to have the Anger upgrade card. And at 5 points, every time you suffer 1 or more wounds, you are going to be gaining an aim token. And I have to say, I'm usually never a fan of Anger, but I think it fits in with Darth Maul perfectly. Not only does he make great use of aim tokens with that large dice pool and no surge, but he is going to be taking wounds, and he is likely going to be playing a command card that gives him a wound on the turn when he needs to charge into combat and hit hardest. To sum it up, Maul basically has a 1-pip that is going to alpha strike him into combat, activate that Joyo Mastery if you haven't already received it, and then unleash hell on whatever unit he's engaged with. So yeah, I think your 5 points are going to be incredibly well spent on Anger, more so than any other Force user build I've seen in this game. You are pretty much guaranteed to get 1 aim token out of this card when you need it the most, which I'll be honest may or may not be worth 5 points, but you will likely be making use of it after that as you receive more wounds as the match goes on. So this is very much going to be one of those cards where I would almost never recommend it, but here is the one build on the one unit in this game where it absolutely will come in handy. So while this card is going to be a bona fide yes from me, it's definitely not a must take, I would say. And I think there are better cards to put on someone like General Grievous or Dooku if you're strapped for those 5 points. But if you have the luxury to spend, it's definitely a strong contender to throw onto Maul. And after that, we are going to have Force Guidance, which is going to be a 10-point exhaustible, giving up to 2 friendly units at range 1 to 2 a Surge token. And you could technically apply this to Maul to give him a Surge token and compensate for that lack of defensive and offensive Surge. However, I do think it is better to prioritize just taking a dodge or an aim over that, as they are just more or less more solid ends to the means, of which Darth Maul can do without having to pay for because of his Joyo Mastery. So, while I do like Force Guidance as a card, it is going to be a skip on almost anyone who doesn't have Master of the Force, especially Darth Maul. And next, we are going to have Fear, a very cheap upgrade for 3 points that is going to give Darth Maul Demoralize 1, giving 1 suppression token to an enemy unit at range 1 to 2 at the end of the rally step. And this card is more or less always going to be a maybe from me, because it is going to wholly rely on whether you're going with a suppressionless build or not. If you're bringing along CAD with a suppression bomb and a bunch of droidicas and other methods of suppression, I would say go ahead and throw it on Maul, but if you're not building your entire list around suppressing your enemies and getting them to fall off the table, go ahead and just skip right over this one. It's a cheap upgrade, but it only really plays into that one army-wide gimmick. But that is going to bring us along to our last Force Power, which is a new one that's going to be Force Barrier. And I do love this card. It is a 10-point exhaustible card that is going to allow you to block either 1 critical or 2 hit results from a friendly unit at range 1 when they're defending. However, you are playing the Trade Federation here, and your friendly units nearby are going to be B1 battle droids. And while this could totally add up over the grand scheme of things, it's really not when you don't have Master of the Force, and I think Darth Maul spending one of his actions every turn to untap this card is kind of a waste. However, I will say this, if you do plan on running a very hero-heavy Trade Federation list, which with all the heavy hitters they have available to them may very well become a meta, having all of your dark side heroes kind of overlap with Force Barrier to protect each other while they mob up the field may end up being a very viable strategy. And if Count Dooku and General Grievous and Darth Maul are all marching towards you and they are continually popping this Force Barrier and blocking all the hits that you are dumping into them, it very well could be devastating, as you may not be able to get the damage in while they close in and then chew through your ranks. So as Maul as a solo operative, it's going to be a big no from me, but Maul alongside a bunch of other heroes who may also be taking the same Force upgrade, it could be something worth looking at. So because of that and that alone, I am going to put it as a maybe, but again, much like the previous one, I am going to say it's a very situational one. And if you're looking to build Maul as a kind of independent operator who's going to just run up and do damage on the field, I would probably skip over Force Barrier. So to sum Force Powers up, we have a very much must-take with the Saber Throw, and then a very strong contender for Anger, although not completely necessary, and then a few situational builds here, such as Fear and Force Barrier, that are going to require you to consider what else is in your list. But let's go ahead and move along to Darth Maul's 2 training upgrade slots and see what he can make use of here. And again, with the 2-slot upgrade, we ask the question, is there a must-take that you should be equipping here? And personally, I believe that there is, yeah. As we discussed with the Anger upgrade and Joyo Mastery earlier, Maul is going to be taking wounds. So why not go ahead and take Tenacity and get a 5th red dice in his dice pool to bump his melee attacks up to a whopping 9 dice attack. So with Darth Maul's masochist character build in Star Wars Legion, I would say go ahead and take Tenacity. It's definitely going to come into play on this character. And with it, I think you are going to be making plays where you will see entire infantry squads wiped with 1 attack from Maul. But we have a whole nother slew of contenders for that 2nd upgrade slot for training, so let's go ahead and take a look at the other options. And first up here, we are going to have the Duck and Cover card, allowing you to give yourself a suppression and effectively cover 1 when needed for just 4 points. And this is a solid contender for most heroes, as it is going to allow them to negate damage that they don't want to receive. And for Maul, it could help keep those wounds off him until you want to pop that 1 card, and then trigger a self wound, and then activate Joyo Mastery. However, I don't think you're going to be worrying about that too much, And personally, I do believe that the Duck and Cover card loses a little bit of luster when it is on melee-focused units, because you don't want to be caught in the open anyways, you want to close ground, get into melee, so your opponents can't engage you en masse, and you can make the best use of your lightsaber weapon attack pool. So I wouldn't really knock you if you did end up taking Duck and Cover on Maul, but for me it is going to be a no. Again, I would much rather just not spend points and make use of line of sight obscuring cover with that jump 1, or dodge tokens to avoid getting damage. And hey, if Maul does get damage, your Joyo Mastery kicks into effect a little bit earlier, and you don't really have to take that wound when you play that one command card, so no big deal. And next up we are going to have Hunter, that is going to give Darth Maul 1 aim token when he attacks a wounded unit, which is an upgrade that costs 6 points. And Hunter is very powerful, especially when you have a unit that is going to be targeting enemy heroes. And I will say that Darth Maul is going to be doing just that. Without getting too ahead of ourselves, he does have a card that gives him the Jedi Hunter keyword, incentivizing him to hunt down and engage enemy heroes. And with 4 red dice and 4 white dice, Maul does make great use of aim tokens. He is going to be needing to spend them almost every time he attacks, so having a surplus of them is very much welcome. But I don't think it's going to be particularly necessary, as you can take surplus tokens with that Joyo Mastery. And I don't think you're really going to be relying on those white dice to finish off enemy characters anyways. So this card is going to be a maybe from me, although it could be a very strong contender if you are going to be facing off against enemy Jedi, and if you know your opponent just got his Anakin Skywalker painted and is ready to field him, maybe go ahead and throw it on there. I really do like Hunter as a card, it's just not cheap, and I feel like if you don't get 2 aim tokens off it every game, you're not really getting your points worth. But after that, we are going to have Endurance, allowing you to remove 1 suppression token at the end of your activation, and honestly, I don't think Maul is going to be worrying too much about that. Unless you're playing an Empire player, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of lists that are going to be threatening a Courage 3 character. And unlike Anakin, he's not really going to suffer too hard from taking suppression tokens, especially with that Joyo Mastery, so I think this is going to be a major skip on Darth Maul. But after that, we are going to have the Overwatch upgrade, which is going to give you Sentinel, increasing your standby range to 3, which is pretty useless on Darth Maul, considering that his only ranged attack he can get is range 2. You're basically going to be paying 4 points for nothing, no reason to take Overwatch, so that's a hard skip for Darth Maul. But after that, we are going to have Offensive Push, giving you Tactical 1 for 4 points, again, an exhaustible card, and when you make a standard move, you are going to be gaining an aim token, and this is relatively useful on Darth Maul. As I've said maybe 5 times already, he benefits greatly from aim tokens. However, I'm not sure if this character is going to find time to recover on the battlefield. And with Joyo Mastery, I think it's going to be more efficient to just go ahead and take aim tokens with that extra action, rather than making a recovery and then moving to tap this card, only to recover it again. I feel like you will just be saving 4 points for the exact same end goal there. It's not a terrible upgrade, and we might look at a fun build later where we can incorporate it in with some exhaustible force powers, but for the most part this is going to be a skip for me. I just don't think it's really going to fit in with Darth Maul's Generalist playstyle. And after that, we are going to have Situational Awareness for just 2 points that is going to give him Outmaneuver, allowing dodge tokens to cancel critical hits. And honestly, this is a pretty great card to have on a hero, especially one who's going to have surplus actions in which you can take dodge tokens with. So at just 2 points, it is very easy to squeak this into a list, and there are far worse characters that you could put this onto besides Darth Maul. I find myself in a lot of situations where I'm building standard lists and I do come out to numbers like 797 or 798, and I can't quite squeeze in an upgrade that I really want, but I don't want to leave the vacant points, so Situational Awareness is definitely a strong contender to fill that little tiny minutiae gap there, and I think it will fit very well at home with Maul. However, I do think this card is much more beneficial on range units than it is on melee units, and with all that considered, I think this is going to be a strong maybe on Maul. Basically, if you have that very tiny pool of extra points in your list, go ahead and throw it on Maul. I think he's probably the best character on which you can equip it. But for the most part, I definitely wouldn't consider it a necessity or anything to obsess over. But I think I will be creating a build later on that is going to include this card. And after that, we are going to have the reversible offensive stance, defensive stance card, which is a 5-point upgrade. And this is going to allow you to basically double down on your aim or dodge tokens while not being able to spend the other while the card is on one side. To put it bluntly, if you have your defensive stance, if you take a dodge token, you double down and get 2 of them, but you can't spend any aim tokens, and then vice versa if you flip the card. And I actually think this could be a very, very powerful card on Maul, as you are basically going to be able to move twice with Joyo Mastery, and then take a dodge token and get 2 dodge tokens, which will keep you alive until you close the gap with your enemies. And then once you are there, you can flip it to offensive stance and get 2 aim tokens to help you reroll all of those dice that you are inevitably going to be getting blank faces on. So while not a necessity, this card is going to be a yes from me. Now, disclaimer, I still have not play tested this card. I haven't been able to play Legion. I don't even own this card at the moment. But it looks like it could be potentially powerful on a lot of builds, and I think Maul is one of the stronger contenders. And down the road, I may come back and say that this is absolutely a must-take on Maul, and I could definitely see it being extremely effective on every Jedi character when used properly. But that really is the gimmick of the card, and using it properly is the name of the game, and the finesse that is going to come down to the commander and their skill. So I'm not sure if I will be running this on my first game with Maul, but I absolutely will be trying out on my second or third, and I would like to hear any and all of your feedback of using this card, not just on Darth Maul, but other characters. And if you have used it on Maul, let me know how it goes. I think it has a very, very strong potential of being absolutely devastating with him. But that is going to move us along to our very last training card, which again is a new one that's going to be Seize the Initiative. And this is a 5-point disposable card that is going to allow you to issue yourself a face-up order token. Now, this is very, very useful, especially on an operative, as you want them out of your command pool and not disrupting things like your troops or your commanders when you need them the most. And I know a lot of people are going to say that this is a must-take card, not just on Maul, but almost any operative or commander unit out there. And I would be hard-pressed to disagree with you. It's a great card to have up your sleeve, and I think it will almost always be worth the 5 points you spend on it. However, I will make note that Darth Maul does have 2 1-pip cards, meaning he is going to have face-up order tokens a lot of times, along with the initiative to make use of them when you need them the most. And honestly, I think you could scrape by with those 2 1-pip cards rather than having to equip Seize the Initiative on him to make sure he activates 3 times in a row when you absolutely need it. But if you plan on running a very diverse list and you want to have that kind of control over your order pool and the tokens you have face up, this is very much a welcome card to take. It's going to be a yes from me, but not one that I think is wholly necessary, and I think you may be able to get by without it. But a very useful card, one worth looking at, considering, and potentially fielding in one of your multiple Maul builds when you're trying to figure this character out. Again, I look forward to using this one too, alongside some of the other upgrades and in other combinations, to see how it works out, and to see how useful it is on not just Darth Maul, but other operatives and hero characters. Personally, I wouldn't be surprised if I'm downplaying this card a little bit too hard. It could become a mainstay on every character you run, and no matter what. But again, I don't have this card in my hand. I haven't really been able to play much Legion lately because of COVID and work. And ultimately, I'm not a psychic, so I'm telling you, keep a very strong eye on it. It could come into play, so keep your eye on it and definitely experiment with it. But with all things considered, with all of Maul's upgrade slots, I think you could honestly get away with running him with just Saber Throw and Tenacity for just plus 9 points at 169. Keep Maul kind of bare bones, and he is going to be able to outbrawl a whole lot of units on the battlefield and lethally engage them, not just in melee, but at range too. Past that, I think a lot of the upgrade cards are going to be luxury upgrades for Maul, but hey, we're playing the Trade Federation, we have B1 battle droids that are cheap as dirt, we can afford the luxury cards, and we will look at some potential builds with other cards when we get along further in the video. But for now, let's move along and take a look at Darth Maul's command cards, as they are quite spicy. And first of all here, we are going to go ahead and mention, because it is the first card, that Darth Maul actually has 2 1-pip cards, with one of them counting as his 3-pip in terms of deck building. But when you play it, it is essentially a 1-pip, meaning you will get that initiative should you field it properly. And this 3/1-pip card that Maul has is going to be titled At Last. And this triggers just Maul himself, giving only him a face-up order token. but it will let you go ahead and gain 1 aim token and the Jedi Hunter keyword for 1 turn. And that is a keyword that is going to give you Surge to Crit, which is very useful with the large attack pool that Darth Maul has. However, it is only for the turn. It's not a permanent upgrade like Anakin, but you combine that with an aim token and you're going to be able to get a lot of hits onto an enemy target. But on top of that aim token and that keyword that he's going to gain, Maul is going to have the option to gain 1 wound when he activates on the turn you play this card. And that is essentially going to give him a kicker there that activates his Joyo Mastery, giving him the ability to perform that extra action. So this is essentially going to be your go time card. This is the card you're going to play on the turn where you're going to have Maul activating and running into combat with an enemy hero who will likely be a Jedi or another Force user. And that aim token and Surge to Crit is going to cover your bases and make sure you can move, attack without suffering too many failed dice. And the ability to take 1 wound with this card is going to make sure that you can activate your Joyo Mastery and give you a little bit of more direct control over how Maul plays on the battlefield. And overall, I think this is a pretty fantastic card, maybe Maul's best. Not only is it a 3-pip that acts as a 1-pip, but again, it gives you complete control over when you have that Joyo Mastery going, and you can even choose whether he takes a wound or not when you play it. It's not mandatory, so that way if you already have wounds and your Joyo Mastery active, you can choose to not suffer the wounds. And that's honestly something that I wasn't expecting them to do with Maul, because I thought they were going to make you automatically suffer a wound because of his sort of reckless behavior. But the fact that you don't makes this card amazing, and it's going to make him really good at engaging enemy heroes. So personally, I do think this is a must-take if you are running Maul, as it is one of his most appealing cards to me. After that, we are going to have his 2-pip, which is the Phantom Menace, and this will activate Maul and 1 other trooper, and it is going to be a Divulge card, and you divulge it during the deploy unit setup, and Maul will gain the Infiltrate keyword. Now, that's pretty potent. We have a lightsaber wielder who can infiltrate onto the battlefield. However, if this card is divulged and gives Darth Maul Infiltrate, you do have to immediately discard it right after doing so. But if you do not discard it and you keep it in your inventory, you can play it as a 2-pip, again activating Maul and 1 other trooper, and it has the text that reads, Maul cannot attack, and enemy units beyond range 2 of Maul cannot attack him. Now, while that does seem pretty lackluster on face value, as you really do want to be making use of Maul's very large attack pool, I could see this being played and used as a very effective way to get Maul up the field while drawing minimum firepower. And if you're running a list with a cheaper commander alongside Maul, like a T-Series tactical droid, this may be a desirable play. However, if you are running this card in your deck, I'm assuming it's because you're trying to give Maul the Infiltrate and get him up the field faster. That being said, infiltrating a hero isn't always the best move in this game, as it can lead to them drawing a certain amount of unwanted firepower, and result in them getting killed off earlier than you may want. However, if that amount of firepower that the enemies sink into Maul turns out to be an overwhelming investment for your opponents, it could give you the game by having the rest of your army advance and cover objectives or tactical positions. So while I do think infiltrating a Jedi is very powerful, it is also a very risky move, and it is nice to have an alternative to the Divulge here, and gives Maul a little bit of flexibility in how you want to field him. But I will be honest, if you are running Darth Maul with a very diverse list with other heroes, there might be other command cards you want to take instead of this one. So while I do think this card is very befitting of Maul's character and is very interesting to have in his arsenal, I wouldn't blame you if you leave it out of a lot of your deck builds. But lastly, we are going to have Darth Maul's 1-pip card, which is Duel of the Fates. And again, this one is going to activate just Maul himself, and that is going to give him 1 dodge token and the Disengage keyword. It also states in the text that when Maul is engaged with an enemy unit, they cannot spend their green tokens. Green tokens, of course, being Dodge, Aim, Standby, or Surge. And while this card doesn't look too flashy at first with just Disengage and a Dodge token, I think it is actually a very, very creative card and acts as a sort of inverse to his 3-pip/1-pip card, At Last. At Last is very much when Maul is on the offensive and going in for the strike, where Duel of the Fates is where he's more or less reevaluating the situation, easing off back, and looking for a new avenue of attack. In that epic fight scene in episode 1, we see him constantly disengaging and re-engaging against Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, and he very much knows when to take a few steps back, stay on the defensive, and reevaluate the situation before going in for another strike. And I think that's exactly what this card is. Sure, you could play it when you're just trying to attack a token-stacked unit of clones or someone like Obi-Wan, but I think there is a lot of very cunning ways to use this card. Now, I need to brush up on the melee rules for the game a little bit, but let's think of a scenario like this. You're engaged with Obi-Wan in melee combat and you've been exchanging blows in the previous turn. Obi-Wan now preps a card and has a ton of tokens stacked onto him, and he's ready to wail on Darth Maul. Well, at the beginning of the turn, you decide to play this 1-pip, and all of a sudden, all those tokens that he stacked onto Obi-Wan cannot be used. You go ahead and you let Obi-Wan attack first with his relatively lackluster attack pool, and he is unable to spend any of his aim tokens, and you use your dodge token here, and prevent some damage from coming onto Maul, even if just a few wounds get through. After that, you activate Maul. You use Maul's first action here to attack Obi-Wan, and all of a sudden he can't use any of those dodge or surge tokens. And then all of a sudden has 5 red dice because you're taking tenacity on him, and 4 white dice, which is ideally enough wounds to sneak through and potentially kill him. But even if it doesn't kill Obi-Wan, you just go ahead and make use of that disengage, and you spend the next 2 actions in your turn making 2 movement speeds, and go right into an enemy unit of clones that are fully buffed up with tokens, ready to engage your nearby droids on an objective. Now, you're not going to be able to attack those clones this turn, but all of a sudden they're tied up in melee and they can't use any tokens, because now they are the ones who are engaged with Maul. So you've essentially tied up 2 enemy units for the turn, and wasted a lot of their battlefield potential by essentially nipping their ability to buff themselves up with tokens. And is that a risky play that may get Maul killed? Yes, absolutely. But so is Obi-Wan's Sarastru Mastery, and a lot of the other mechanics that we see with these Jedi in these games. So while I don't like this card quite as much as At Last, I do think it is a pretty clever and unique card, and I think a good commander could make some pretty game-winning moves with it if he seizes on any such opportunities that arise. So overall, I do think Darth Maul's command cards are very in line with an operative and Maul's character. It's very self-centric, and there's not a lot of team play going on here. But we do have a character who can get into the fight fast, and then manipulate the fight either offensively or defensively should he choose. And I think that gives Maul a lot more creativity in how you're going to play these command cards, compared to someone like Anakin, who just has a sort of linear, expectable process. All that said, I think Maul actually benefits from the ability to kind of run him thin. You could actually probably run him with nothing other than At Last as a command card and operate pretty effectively on the battlefield. I don't think you necessarily need his 2-pip, and the 1-pip you could honestly maybe do without. But of course with the droid army, that's going to rely on what else is in your list, and if you need that coordinate going on throughout your army, and if you have other command cards that are going to be better suited for your list. Maybe running all 3 of Maul's command cards is the best option for you. But that amount of flexibility with Maul in list building is something that I really like about him. But let's go ahead and look at some potential builds for Maul and how I would equip him in your list, and how that would affect his playstyle on the battlefield. And for the most part, I think Maul is going to be pretty streamlined when it comes to how you equip him. He doesn't have any keywords like Exemplar like Anakin does, so he is going to be a pretty self-centered, offensive-based Sith operative. So first off, we're going to go ahead and look at his Generalist build, and this is how I probably would run Maul 9 out of 10 times. Maybe even 9.9 out of 10 times. And first up here as an absolute must is going to be Saber Throw for 5 points. Again, you're throwing 4 red dice at range 2, with impacts and pierce 2. It's just a very lethal offensive ranged weapon, and one that I think you're really going to be missing out on if you're not taking it. This is going to give Maul a lot of reach with his Joyo Mastery, and your opponents 100% will fear you when you start closing in on them with that range 2 attack. After that, I am going to be equipping Anger on Darth Maul. This is going to be a strong maybe, and if you're tight on points, you perhaps could leave it out, but I think it is going to help you more so on him than any other character in the game, as Maul is going to be guaranteed to take at least 1 wound throughout the match. And if you play that At Last card properly, you are going to be getting 2 aim tokens when you're charging in against the enemy hero. But after that, in training, we are going to have Tenacity as a must-take for me. Again, Maul is going to be getting wounded for that Joyo Mastery. It's just a must for him, and that's going to give you 1 extra red die to attack with. Red dice are great. Simple as that. However, if for some reason you think you're going to be sitting behind cover all game and just throwing your lightsaber rather than actually engaging in melee, which I don't think you would, you could potentially skip this, but I don't think I will. For me, having Tenacity and Saber Throw are the two must cards, even if they are somewhat contradictory to each other. But lastly, we are going to have our second training slot, and I'll be honest, I will probably be running this blank most of the time. However, there is an argument to be made about taking the defensive and offensive stance card, and maybe keeping it on the defensive stance for most of the time to keep Maul alive with a large surplus of dodge tokens. There's absolutely an argument to be made that he needs aim tokens to be lethal, but at the same time, if he's going to be around for 2 more turns than he would be without a surplus of dodge tokens, he will likely be rolling more dice in the long run and helping you in the overall battlefield control. However, it is worth noting that if you do go this route, it may be worth dropping the anger, as defensive stance is going to bar you from spending that aim token, so I don't really think you should be paying for both upgrades. This is definitely something I want to try out on Maul, but I would prioritize the previous 3 cards over this one. I think it's a little bit out there, and we'll have to see how these cards work on our heroes before I can really make a definitive call on it. But it's definitely worth something keeping your eyes on, and same with the Seize the Initiative card. Now, with 2 1-pips, there is an argument to be made that Maul is going to have face-up order tokens and get activated when he needs to the most, and by the time he's done with those 2 1-pip cards, he will probably be close to death, or already have done his battlefield damage and can kind of sit back a little bit. And while I do agree with that assessment, I don't think that's always going to be the case, and there may be a turn where Maul is locked in combat with a Jedi and has maybe 1 or 2 wounds left, and this is going to allow you to activate him and swing one more time before he dies, which could make the difference in a game. It's also worth noting that Darth Maul is an operative, which is kind of one of those oddball tokens to have in your list, and having a token like that outside of your face-down order pool is very advantageous when you're trying to make those tabletop plays, especially in the late game. So, much like the defensive-offensive stance card, this is 100% one to keep your eye on. I think it could be a very strong contender here, but again, one that I'm not confident on making a definitive call on. But all of this is going to bring Maul up to about 174 and potentially 179 points should you include that second training slot, which still keeps him at a relatively affordable cost as a hero and a list. And honestly, I think this is going to be the one true build for Maul. I think a lot of the divergent options I'm going to show you here are going to be a little bit out there and might fit some people's playstyle, but overall I don't think they're going to perform as much as a raw, damage per second based powerhouse Maul. But I will show you some potential alternatives anyways, and the first of those alternatives we're going to look at is going to be what I call the Control Maul. And this will have you equipping Force Push and Force Choke with your Force powers, and then Offensive Push on one of his training slots. Now, I know you guys like your Force Push, and I figured it was pretty fitting on a character who's going to be hyper-offensive and in the enemy's face. And as you see here with this one, we have 3 exhaustible cards, meaning Maul is going to be using one of those extra actions with Joyo Mastery to make recovery moves every turn, and then tap these cards again. And to levy the fact that he's sort of consuming one of those actions by making a recovery, we are going to be gaining Tactical 1 from that offensive push, giving him an aim token when he does want to engage, and then also Force Choke, which is going to allow him to just knock models off when he otherwise isn't able to engage, or can't get the aim tokens to put out as much damage as he would like. Just automatically removing one model off the table is very efficient, especially when you're playing an army with very expensive infantry like the clones. So this is going to be a Darth Maul build that is very much constructed to counter those castling lists, such as the Imperial gun lines, or perhaps clone troopers who like to get in cover with those Z6s or DC-15s. And this build will likely have Maul infiltrating into the battlefield and getting up in the enemy's faces to dislodge them from their fortified positions, while the rest of your army closes in and mops them up. This is going to require a lot of coordination with your forces though, but I think it could be very effective if played right. I imagine a scenario where a little castle of clone troopers is moving up into cover, and then Darth Maul strikes, runs into melee with one of them, hitting them with an aim token, force pulls another one out of their barricades while a squad of B2s lights them up, and then popping Force Choke on another squad just to do a little bit of damage and soften them up also. It's a build that very much emulates his playstyle in Battlefront 2, where you kind of just get up in a huge group of enemies and then you tap that left bumper, right bumper, and Force Choke and throw them around the battlefield. Still, I do find this to be a riskier build, but if you're one of those die-hard Force Push on all Force users kind of players, give this one a spin. It could be a lot of fun. And lastly, we are going to take a look at one more build, one that's going to prioritize keeping Maul alive for as long as he can on the battlefield, which is going to kind of neuter some of his offensive capabilities, but like I said earlier, if you're going to be alive 2 more turns than you would be traditionally, that's effectively 8 more red dice and 8 more white dice than you would otherwise be throwing, which statistically speaking could be better than a bunch of aim tokens spent. Now, obviously there's more variables to that, but let's go ahead and look at the build that I'm going to call Dodge Maul. And here you will be taking Saber Throw, Force Reflexes, Defensive Stance, and Situational Awareness. And the theme here is obvious. You are going to be taking dodge tokens every turn with Darth Maul and stacking them up on him, just so you can continuously duck those incoming shots. Now, Saber Throw is still included in this one because you're not always going to have the time to run and then use another action to attack if you're doing this. You may just want to be getting 4 dodge tokens with 2 dodge actions and then using your Saber Throw with your last action, which should still be doing some decent damage. Put Maul behind some heavy cover and you are going to have a seriously tough nut to crack. Now, overall, I think this build is a little bit on the silly side. I think it's a little excessive, but honestly, I could see it working out if you choose to infiltrate Maul onto an objective and hunker down on it. It's not something I'm going to be running my first game, but it is something that I likely will be trying at one point. This build also may shine in a situation where you have a smaller list, such as a skirmish game, and you don't have a whole lot of other heavy hitters inside your army. But again, I think that first Generalist build is going to be the build that I would recommend going with, especially during your early games and figuring out how you want to play Maul. And then you guys can branch out from there. I'm sure you're going to come up with some other creative ways to field him, and let me know in the comments below if you do have any other creative ways that have operated pretty successfully for you. I try to be as thorough as I can in these videos, but I'm not all-seeing and all-knowing, and I also haven't really been able to play the game a whole lot recently, so I am a little bit rusty. But now we're on to the superfluous part of the video where I talk about the model, and I like the model for Maul a lot more than the model for Anakin. It is very cool. I love the multiple poses that he comes with, and the fact that you can do a saber behind or in front of him, and the options of faces is very cool. However, I am slightly disappointed that we didn't get a hooded version with his cloak up, but that's alright. I think everyone would have just painted him with the horns anyways. I probably would have been the outliner, meaning I should just go do it with green stuff if I really want to. But what do I think of Maul as a unit in the game? Well, all things considered, and not even taking his probe droids into account for this review, I think he is a fantastic unit. I think the rules represent him great. I think he has a lot of potential for damage output. I think he has very crafty and creative command cards. And where he really shines is that I think he will be very flexible in lists. The fact that he doesn't have a whole lot of gimmicks built into him is kind of refreshing, as it means he's going to be able to do a lot of things on the battlefield decently well, and your opponents aren't just going to feel out a typical pattern for him after fighting him a few times. However, the only thing I'm really worried about with Maul is his overall survivability. I think he is going to be a hero who dies a lot. And if you go way back to my Droidicas video, I talk about threat level assessment for your opponent and how you kind of need to overwhelm them with targets, otherwise your good units are going to get wiped out one by one. The same thing is going to apply to Maul, especially if you are infiltrating him. I think you can make for an excellent distraction Carnifex, or a very good forward position operative to lock down objectives. But I think he is going to require a lot of finesse and skill with the commander to make sure he doesn't get blasted off the battlefield prematurely. But how would I rank Darth Maul? And this is really a tough question for me, because while I really do like him on the battlefield and I love that Joyo mastery and what you can do with that, he is lacking in some fields, especially as a Force user, as he does not have Master of the Force, and that does lose a lot of luster for those 2 Force upgrade slots. The lack of something like Charge and Surges is also a bit problematic with him. Sure, he gets things like Jedi Hunter and that extra action with his mastery, but those are gimmicks that require other setups. They have their drawbacks, their consequences, and Joyo Mastery in particular is a bit of a monkey's paw, but all that is levied by his points cost, which I think is very much earned. So I am going to be giving Darth Maul a B+. I'm tempted to kick it up to an A-, but I think to be a truly great Jedi, you do need to have a Master of the Force, especially if you're going to tease us with those 2 Force upgrade slots. Maul is also an operative and not a commander, and like I mentioned earlier, operatives are a bit of a ugly duckling when it comes to list building, is their command cards usually take away from your overall army cohesion, and that unique order token can often mess up the ebb and flow of your turn-by-turn plays. So I like Maul a lot, and I will be running him, and I'm very excited to field him and have him in my collection. I think he's way more flexible than some of the previous heroes we've been getting for the Trade Federation, and I think we have finally gotten a scenario where the mirror releases of the Trade Federation and the Republic, the Trade Federation CIS actually outshines the Republic counterpart for once. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't want my Darth Maul going 1 vs 1 against Anakin, but I think he's going to slide into a lot more list better. But let me know what you guys think below. Have you used Maul yet? How does he play on the battlefield? Do you think he is better than Anakin? If you have any comments or suggestions or experience with the character, let me know in the comments below. As always, explain your reasoning. And if you liked the video, go ahead, leave a like. If you want to see more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel. And until next time, guys, take care.